study that I'm doing, and and I look at parallels. I've been doing a lot of study in history, mainly in ancient antiquity and ancient civilizations, and there's so many parallels between the civilizations and what they have done that I see that is going on today. Things that are happening among us. That I believe that all things end up repeating itself and going through a cycle. And there was a very strong influence when we read the Bible, especially in the New Testament period, from the period of the Old Testament in the book of Malachi and then coming into Matthew. There was a period that most folks have called the silent period, or the quiet period, the silent time. And it receives its name because we don't have any biblical text between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament from the book of Matthew, which was written somewhere into the mid to the late first century A.D. But there was still a lot of activity that was going on and happening during this time frame. Matter of fact, probably one of the most pivotal times in the history of civilizations was going on in the time that what we call the silent time, the silent era. Was there text being written? There were texts that was written. One of those texts that was written was known as the Book of Maccabees, and come from the Hasmonean Empire, some Hasmoneans that had risen up, and they were, in essence, opposing Greek culture. They themselves accepted a lot of the Greek culture, but they wanted to rededicate the temple. But in essence, they were trying to gain political power in the temple, and they kicked out the high priest. And the high priest ended up going down by the Dead Sea in the Judean wilderness, and what we know today is the people of the Essenes, Qumran, where we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they tried to keep record. They called themselves the Sons of Light. They believed there would be a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They taught about an end that was coming, and they were keeping all of the sacred texts. Matter of fact, one of the oldest complete scrolls that we have today is a result of their efforts, and this is over 2,000 years ago, before the time of Christ, because some people have argued that Isaiah was written to compensate or to justify Jesus as being the Messiah because of the prophecies of Christ, and Isaiah talks about the prophecies of Christ. Christ fulfills those prophecies, and so in that scrolls that were found, these scrolls were written. They found proof of that in 1947 when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and one of the most complete Isaiah scrolls dating before the time of Christ, dating to the period of the Essenes and the Hasmonean Empire, was found there in Qumran. And it's one of the most complete that we have to date that prophesies and tells of the coming of Jesus Christ. But that period of 400 years was critical and pivotal because of a character by the name of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had come, he was a young man, a young warrior, a young great general that after his father was murdered, he took over the empire of the Greeks, the Macedonian Empire, and within 10 years, Alexander the Great had conquered more territory than any other that had ever known, and even today, there's no one else that was able to conquer as much territory that Alexander the Great conquered within 10 years by the means that he had. In 332 B.C., he comes into the land of Israel. And he begins to spread. He comes into Israel, he goes into Egypt, he comes back out of Egypt, and then he pushes on into India. Then he gets sick. He starts heading back. They try to appeal to him to go back to Macedonia. He never makes it. On his way back, I believe he dies in Babylon and passes away there at a very young age, in his early 30s. But within 10 years, starting out in just his early 20s up into his early 30s, he had conquered and developed one of the greatest empires that was known. But in the process of that, there was a system that was happening, and it was known as Hellenization. The word Hellas is a word that is used simply for Greece. It's the Greek word for Greece. And Hellenization is about Greek culture being spread throughout the regions and throughout the empire. But in 332 and Alexander, this was only the spread of this Greek culture during his time. It became more prominent. It became more fluid. It was expanding more rapidly. But Greek culture was really being taken on for a long time. It had developed many, many centuries before. We find Greeks were settled into the southern parts of Italy before Rome ever develops as a nation or as an empire. The Greeks have a great stronghold in the midst of this time period. And they had several different ideals, pagan worship, different types of culture. Some have looked at it and said, oh, it was a good thing. There was advancement. There was prosperity. Many people learned many things. But it was a very dangerous thing. And it was a very dangerous because that it led people to worship all types of ideals of God, what they believed in God. So tonight, I'm going to teach just a little bit because, as I said, this is something that I'm working on. But look a little bit at Italy. And I want to look at Italy and the development of Rome. And we're going to look at some of the things that happened here and some of the things that happened with this empire. And I want to look at some of the early culture that was taking root. And many of us have talked about Rome. Many of us have talked about Greek. Some of us have mentioned Hellenization and have often pondered about it, wondered about it. We've often identified Rome as being a strong, valiant empire that had great influence. We've often, when we say Rome, we associate it with paganism, but we also associate it with development of roads and bridges and aqueducts. But for the most part, we think of Rome, we think of the evil and the wicked that is tied with Rome and the pagan gods that they worship. We think of Greek, we think of Mars Hill, we think of Athens, we think of Paul going into Athens and going to Mars Hill and him seeing all of the pagan altars. And he said they had an altar to every god they could think of. And if in case they missed one, they set up an altar to the unknown God. And they said, Paul said, he used it as a platform. He said, let me make known to you the God you don't know. It's evident you don't know him because you're worshiping every other god that's ever came out of the imagination of man. And let me tell you about the true God, the real God. And Paul used that as a platform. So you can, when we've taken our group, some of those that are here tonight, we've taken to Israel. We visited several of the places throughout Israel, trying to take you to areas that Rome had great influence, even the Crusaders that had influence, even the Arabic times, Islamic times that had influence, and down through the ages. You can see how much really Rome influenced Israel, how much impact it made. But they wasn't really primary. The Greeks were primary and beyond that. But I want to talk a little bit about how some of these gods developed. And I'm going to use several slides. But something I found that was really peculiar to me, something that I seen that has a great parallel, and I think that you're going to possibly see that tonight as well, and I want you to see it. I hope that you see it, and we're trying to outline it the best we can. So I'm going to go all the way back. I want to take us back to the early stages of Italy, before Rome ever becomes an empire. And remembering that Rome is kind of, and Italy is kind of behind the eight ball. Greek civilization is much more advanced by this time period. Matter of fact, when you talk about the Iron Age in Israel, they date it to 1200 BC. When they talk about the Iron Age in Italy, they date it to 1000 BC, about 200 years behind in their development. But when it takes off, it takes off. But I want to look at some of the ideals, how that they develop. As Brother Nick will put up those slides for me, we'll go through these as much as we can. If you want to take notes, please take notes. And we're just going to hit this and do some teaching. Of course, the map of Italy, looking back at Italy, someone says, how does this relate to Scripture or the Bible? It has everything to do with it because of the early civilizations, the mindsets, the ideology, where pagan worship came from, where worship of pagan gods came from. And Italy had a great influence later on to Israel and to the people of Israel and to the biblical time. But even early on, during the Philistine era, the Philistines, and we shared this with our Wednesday night group, the Philistines were Mycenaean people that came from Asia Minor, what we call Turkey. They came and settled on the seashore plains of Israel. The Philistines were one that David battled. They talked about them having pagan gods and pagan worship. They established 5 cities known as the Pentapolis, Penta in Greek meaning 5, but they had a Greek culture with them. You could look at their pottery. You could look at the stages of what they developed and what they taught and how they lived. They had this Greek culture about them. And David fought the Philistines. We know in the time of David, David fights the Philistines. But the Philistines, most people believe that the Philistines arrived in the seashore plains of Israel about the same time that Joshua came in from the east across the Jordan River and was conquering the hills and conquering the Canaanites. And the Canaanites had rule throughout there. The Canaanites were a Semitic people. They came from Mesopotamia, from the east, and they had settled in the land of Israel. And we know that they were cursed. We find Canaan was the son of Noah, one of the sons or grandsons of Noah, one of the grandsons of Noah. There was a curse against him because of their father Ham and what he had done in uncovering his father Noah's nakedness. There was a curse pronounced against them. They were not to have or to inhabit the land of Israel. And so God used Joshua and the people of Israel to conquer them. But during this scene and setting, they believed that some of the early Philistines were settled just along where Gaza is. If you look on the map of Israel, Gaza was where the Philistines lived. And on just a little bit north of that, you'll find also a city known as Gath, just a little northeast of Gaza. Gath is where Goliath was from. And these 5 cities were major players during this time until David comes and conquers them. Joshua conquers the Canaanites. David comes along and conquers the Philistines. The Phoenicians were also Semitic people who lived, and I preached about this last Sunday night, who lived up on the northern parts of Israel. And here on the northern parts, the Phoenicians brought with them again, as I mentioned last week, all of this culture and this Greek culture into the land of Israel. But where did it originate? And that's kind of what I want to look at tonight. And remembering that Greece is pretty well established. And on this map, you can see that not only is Greece and the Greek people here, but they had also settled along the southern coast of Italy and also in Sicily. They were upon the island of Sicily. The Phoenicians that we talked about last week were also known as Carthaginians. They had lived in the place of Carthage in northern Africa, and they also settled in Sardinia, the other island just off the coast of Italy. But Italy was unique in its developmental stage. The people that probably had some of the greatest influence, they were divided up by several different tribes. The Greeks in the south, but here in the orange area was people known as Etruscans. This is where we can find a lot that Rome later develops. And if you would look on the map, Rome just sets right in this violet-colored region, and the Etruscans is all of this area up here, and Rome is part of the Latins, the Latin-speaking people. And the Etruscans had a language that was unique. Matter of fact, they can't find any comparative to the Etruscans in their language. It was written in Greek, but their vocabulary, their structure, how they spoke it, to even to date, there's only about 100 words that they have figured out of the Etruscans and how they have spoke. But the Etruscans had a great impact upon Italy and especially upon Rome. And we're going to see that in just a moment.